Start the recording, please. Thank you. Okay, convener, it's over to you.
Right. Well, welcome to all those in attendance at this remote meeting of the local review body of Aberdeen City Council. Please note that the meeting will be recorded and published online for public access after the meeting. You're also reminded to note that we may have members of the public or press observing today's proceedings. My name is Councillor Del Henrickson, and I will be chairing the meeting today. The other two members in attendance are Councillors Christian Allard and Lynn Thompson. Can I ask those who are observing today's meeting to keep the microphones and cameras switched off throughout? And can all members of the review body leave their cameras on but mute their microphones when not speaking? As the local review body contains quasi-judicial business, members are reminded that they should not leave the meeting during consideration of any of the reviews. This meeting has been convened in response to a request for a review of the decision taken by the appointed officer under the council's scheme of delegation. Members of the local review body have before them copies of the review documents as listed in the notice calling this meeting. I will now ask Mrs. Lindsay McBain, the Assistant Clerk, to outline the procedures and to be followed by the conduct of these reviews.
Okay, thank you, convener. Members have the procedure note which was circulated with the meeting papers, and it is intended to set out the wider framework within which the review process operates. From this, it is clear that the first task for the local review body is to come to a decision on whether the review documents contain sufficient information for the case to be determined without further procedure, and by that it is meant without further information or representations. To assist, I feel it would be helpful to mention the following. Firstly, that the regulations governing the local review process require that all matters which the applicant intends to raise in the review must be set out in or accompany the notice of review. Secondly, that the focus of the review should be on the basis of what was before the appointed officer when a decision was made, and only in exceptional circumstances will new or additional matters be permitted to be taken into account. Thirdly, to note that the modernisation of the planning system, which included revisal of the planning appeals process, of which this local review body is part, removed the previous right on the part of an applicant to insist on a hearing and replaced that with a local review body, providing them with the power to choose a procedure which more accurately reflects the facts and circumstances of the individual case. And lastly, that guidance set out by the Scottish Government's Chief Planner in 2011 stated that reviews by local review bodies should be conducted by means of full consideration of the application afresh. This review should take the form of a structured discussion led by the chairperson to consider the matter set out in the notice of review before you, and I would conclude by drawing your attention in particular to points 10 to 12 of the procedure note. Thank you, Chairperson.
Sorry, Councillor Henrickson, you're on mute.
Thank you. Turning to consideration of the review in respect of the decision to refuse the application for the erection of 14 residential flats over 3 and 4 stories, 1 shop unit and subdivision of existing flat to form 2 flats with associated infrastructure at High Point 242 North Deeside Road, Aberdeen, Peter Cooter, AB 14 0UQ, planning reference number 211791/DPP. We will again hear from the planning advisor, Ms. Green, who will provide us with a brief description of the application proposal and a reminder of the reasons why the application was refused. I would again point out that Ms. Green attends today's meeting to provide us with the necessary professional planning guidance because she has not been involved in the earlier consideration of the application under review. Ms. Green will not, however, be asked to express any view on the merits of the proposed development, and in fact her role will be a neutral one involving the provision of factual information and guidance only. Over to you, Ms. Green.
Thank you, convener. I'll just share my screen. Sorry, it's just sharing the wrong screen. Okay, can you see the screen with the full screen presentation? Yep. Okay. Let's find my notes now. Right. Okay, so the meeting relates to a request for review against the non-determination of the application for full planning permission for the erection of 14 new build flats over 3 and 4 stories, 1 shop unit and the subdivision of an existing flat to form 2 flats with associated infrastructure, all at 242 North Deeside Road, Aberdeen. So as I said previously, an appeal against non-determination takes place where there has not been a decision made on an application during the statutory 2-month period following validation of the application. And in this case, a request for an extension of this period was declined, and the applicant made the request for review correctly submitted with all the necessary information within the time limit following the end of the statutory period. So no new matters have been raised in the review submissions. A case officer report was submitted and 14 days provided for interested parties to comment on that report. Comments were received from the applicant and also from the Community Council. And the applicant then commented also on the Community Council's submission. These responses are on the Council's website, and the response to the case officer's report is also in the agenda. I'll cover the matters raised later in my presentation. So I'll now proceed to describe the site and the proposal. The site's located on the north side of the main road through Cooter, as we saw this morning, and the ground rises towards the north, where there's a large detached house within wooded grounds. To the west is a shop and post office within a traditional 1.5-story building. And to the immediate east is the driveway access to the house to the north, whilst further east is a 4-story building containing flats and set back from the street, with 3 and 4-story buildings set further forward and also containing flats. There's a bar on the site across the North Deeside Road, which is 1.5 stories in height, and also a row of single-story shop units. Then opposite, there are also 3 and 4-story flats and 1.5-story houses. And in the site, which is shown as a gap on this location plan, there's the 3-story building containing the co-op, a dental practice and flats above. So that's the aerial photograph as we saw on site this morning. And the building on the site is a traditional granite building, which has been altered to include a mansard roof, and it contains a shop unit, currently a tanning salon, and has single-story extensions to each side. There you can see the flat above, which is accessed from the rear. This is a 3D view of the site just taken from Google Maps, and you can see the various sheds to the rear. And this plan shows the proposed demolitions of the sheds to the rear of the building and to the side. So the proposed site plan showing the 14 new build site flats and 18 car parking spaces. So the proposal is for the development of 14 new build flats extending back into the site at right angles to the main road. And the two flats would also be created by splitting the existing flat above the shop unit. And this shows the lower level of development with cars accessing to the east and passing underneath the building to the parking spaces on the west. Along the frontage, the existing retail unit of 100 metres squared would remain, and an additional unit of 57 square metres would be provided. And the steps to the flat above the existing shop would be altered so that they run parallel with the back of the building. And there would also be a one-bed flat at this level to the rear of the site, just here. And that would have it's got one small window looking out underneath the building and then windows to the east. So I'll show you the floor plans and elevations in a moment, but this is just the landscape plan showing proposals for the planting of grass, hedging and some trees. And it shows also that there are two spaces located underneath the landscaped area just here. This is showing the line of the retaining wall. And then there's indications of a wall remaining along this side of the site. So this plan shows the roofscape and areas of amenity space, together with the relationship of the proposal to the buildings nearby. That's the ground floor level again, quite similar to the site plan. It just shows the route for pedestrians through underneath the building. And it shows the bin stores just here and here, cycle store, and the two entrances to the flats. Sorry, hopefully you can see my cursor now. The two entrances, the bin stores and the cycle store. Can you see my cursor now? Yeah. So this layout shows a variety of 1 and 2 bed flats, and you can see that some of these most of these are dual aspect, with the exception of the 1 bed flats, flat 5. So the flats in this particular block, other than the ground floor one, which has a small window to the south, are single aspect. And again, the first and second floor are very similar. So that's the second floor. And at third floor level, see there are no flats. That's the roof escape on those two elements. This is a 3-story block, but at a higher level. And this one 4-story, and then 3 stories above the vehicular access, which goes underneath. So these are at the same, the roof level is the same for these 3 sections of the building. And that's just showing the roof plan with the alternate sections pitched at the edges. And then the elevations. So the proposed materials, as we mentioned on site, are the granite cladding and the flat seam metal cladding, glass balustrades, aluminium windows with grey frames, and it can be seen that each flat has access to a private balcony or terrace. And you're just looking through underneath the vehicular access. You can see the cycle parking, which is not underneath the building. It's just looking through and seeing that. And then the parking spaces in this section. So this is showing the south elevation onto North Deeside Road. That's just seeing the building behind there. That's the ridge level. And the north elevation looking, this is the roof of the existing building on site. So you can see the relative heights of the proposed building and the existing shop and flats, shop with flats above. These are cross sections through the length of the site. So this one is through the proposed shop unit. This is North Deeside Road here. This building doesn't appear to be the ones directly opposite because they're further back. It seems to be a building further west. But this is North Deeside Road, the shop unit, and you can just see the change in floor levels there. So I think there's about 0.8 of a metre difference between the floor levels of the existing shop and these flat at the back and the vehicle access underneath. And then you can see the jump towards the north end of the site. And then similarly, looking through the other way, this is North Deeside Road, and this section actually looks, it's handed. So these are the flats to the east, just showing the roofscape behind. So this would be the block that's nearest to the site. And then this is the building that would contain the former Gordon Arms Hotel and the flats on the other side of that. And these two cross sections are taken across the site, so you can just see through the building. That's showing the two parking spaces that are underneath the landscaping. And then the relative heights of the existing roof and the buildings. And again, taken at the point where the vehicles go underneath the building. You can see the relationship there. And that's showing the tree survey. So it shows the two trees to the east. The survey actually shows that this one is of poor health and should be felled. It's obviously on neighbouring land, so not in the control of the applicant. And then trees to the north. And this is showing the zone of influence, which is basically the sort of falling area of the trees. And then the root protection areas. And although this root protection area is shown extending into the site, the tree survey report states that because of this driveway and the boundaries of the site, it's actually unlikely that the roots will be in this area. So it doesn't actually recommend tree protection in that area. And the applicant's agents also provided some visuals within the design and access statement, which we looked at briefly on site. I've added these into the presentation. It's just worth noting on this one that you can't see the two sections of the building that are recessed slightly. You see the three sections that stand slightly further east. So they're kind of tucked in between. And then that's just taken from slightly west of the site. And from opposite across the road. And these are existing plans for the shop unit, just showing that this is the section that would be demolished to the side of the shop and then the sheds to the rear. First and second floor plans. And elevations of the existing building that we saw on site. And then existing sections, just showing the levels that are currently on site. So in terms of the planning history and consultations, the roads team didn't object to the proposal, and they note that the site is located in the outer city and does not lie within an area with any form of controlled parking measures. 18 parking spaces would be proposed, which is considered acceptable, and is considered acceptable due to the provision of cycle parking, the proximity to public transport, and the walking distance to local amenities. Spaces are acceptable in terms of dimensions, and with regard to the proposed vehicle access, there was some consultation with the public transport unit who discussed the possibility of moving the bus stop, the painted on bus stop markings on the road and the flagpole for the bus stop. They also considered that cycle access and connectivity and access to public transport were acceptable. In terms of environmental health, there were no objections from that team. There was a noise impact assessment submitted, and it showed that flats would be subject to road traffic noise, but that could be mitigated by measures which related to windows and acoustic vents. The waste and recycling team, they identified the types of bins that would be required. And the proposals for the bin stores would be slightly over the recommended distances, but that it was considered that those would be accepted. The schools estate team advised that there was adequate capacity in the local primary and secondary schools, and the housing team had no objection and advised that the policy on affordable housing required 25% contribution for developments of 5 units or more, which equates to 3.5 units. And furthermore, that where developments are less than 20 units, the provision may be on-site, off-site, or by commuted payment. In terms of developer obligations, the team advised that contributions would be required towards the core path network, healthcare facilities, and open space in the wider area, as well as the provision of affordable housing. The contaminated land team had no objection and didn't recommend any further intrusive works as being required. Scottish Water also had no objection and provided information on water supply and foul drainage. Police Scotland provided some further comment on design detail and advice on the design. of things like vehicular and pedestrian access. The District Salmon Fishery Board had no objection and advised that there doesn't seem to be potential for significant impact upon the River Dee special area of conservation. North East Scotland Biological Records Centre had no records of species, protected species that related to the site, but they did advise that there are protected species, for example, red squirrel nearby. And Cooter Community Council also objected on the basis of overdevelopment and car parking concerns. They considered that the scale and design of the proposal would be inappropriate to its context and expressed concerns regarding potential conflict with policy regarding affordable housing and low energy developments. There was a further representation submitted following the case officer's report, which was on the following basis: that more flats are not needed in Cooter. Again, that the scheme is overdevelopment, that there are an excessive number of units proposed and limited green space, that there's loss of parking for the community and an increase in demand for parking as a result of the increase in residents, and that affordable housing and low and zero carbon should be conditioned if the application was to be approved. Right, let me just move the slides on. Right, before I get to the reasons for recommendation in the officer's report, I'll just cover the applicant's further statement following receipt of the Community Council comments. And that made the following points: that there's a need for a range of housing in the area and that 16 flats would meet a local need. That if houses were proposed, that would remove the opportunity for a retail unit. They stated that the retail unit would enhance the provision within the village and that this is a brownfield site well connected by public transport and with walking and cycling routes. They highlighted that the proposed local development plan examination may result, that's ongoing, and it may result in the need for more housing sites. They cited the context of the Gordon Arms Hotel flats to the east as a precedent, and similarly the flats at the Co-op, which are 3 stories at the front but 4 stories at the rear. They stated that the existing parking on site is at the discretion of the site owner and could be closed off, and that proposed parking within the site would be available to the public. They stated that they agreed with the affordable housing provision in line with policy, and that and low and zero carbon development could be conditioned, that they would be content to make contributions towards open space off-site and to provide trees and landscaping on-site, that their submissions showed no impact on bats and other interests in terms of protected species, and that there would be economic development and employment benefits to the proposal. There are also 3 representations, 2 objections and 1 in support, and they raised these matters: that there's inaccurate information submitted in terms of shadow analysis and public transport, that the scale of development is excessive in terms of the height of the buildings, and that there's insufficient evidence of carbon reduction requirements, that electric vehicle charging provision is inadequate, that there's inadequate on-site car parking provision, that there would be a reduction of car parking provision on North Deeside Road, that there would be overlooking and loss of privacy to adjacent residential premises and garden ground, a loss of sunlight to adjacent residential premises, adverse impact on adjacent residential property due to noise and lighting associated with the proposed car park, and a loss of views from adjacent residential property to the west. And the owner of the adjacent property to the south welcomed the proposal, as it would result in the redevelopment of a rundown eyesore and the provision of new retail and residential accommodation that would be a positive addition to the village. So in terms of the reasons for recommendation in the case officer's report, so the full report is in the agenda, but the key points were that there was insufficient information with detailed cross sections showing the property to the north, and in terms of shadow analysis and transport statement with clarity on access and service arrangements, and that an additional BAT survey would be required. Concerns relating to residential amenity for the occupiers of the flats, that this was overdevelopment, concerns regarding design quality, road safety concerns at the access, and matters relating to sustainable development. So the applicant's case, they made the following points, that the scale and density had been set, a precedent had been set by buildings adjacent, and that in terms of impact on the retail centre, the proposed retail space size has been maximised, and that customer parking would increase as they could use spaces within the proposed development. In terms of residential amenity, it was stated that the adjacent house to the north is at a higher level, and that report includes shadowcast analysis. That the daylight provision to the proposed flats was acceptable, that the road service does not object to the access. In terms of parking, they stated that residents would use the public transport, and also there's a car park diagonally opposite. That bin stores are only marginally outside the travel distance standard. That the landscaping proposed on site is generous. A tree impact is acceptable, and that planting is proposed, and that an additional BAT survey could be conditioned. Further comments were that the proposal would comply with the low and zero carbon policy, as it would be highly insulated and with air source heat pumps, and that in terms of crime, the car park would be overlooked and movement sensor lights installed, and that the proposal complied with various other policies that were stated, including in the case officer's report. Yeah, sorry, at this point, I'll hand back to you, convener, to confirm whether you wish to have further procedure or to proceed to determine the application.
Thank you, Ms. Green. We have undertaken a site visit this morning, but we need to consider whether we now have sufficient information in front of us today to take a decision on the application. Members, remember that if you do not feel you have enough information to take a decision, you can request that further written information be provided or a hearing arranged. I feel that after today, I do have sufficient information and that we do not need any further procedures. Councillor Allard, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision and if you feel that any further procedures are required? Please state the minutes for the reason why.
I did say at our last meeting, convener, that I had sufficient information. And now after the visit this morning, I might have you a few questions, if it's possible, Convener.
Yes, we can follow on with questions. Councillor Thompson, could you please state if you have sufficient information to take a decision, and if you do not feel any further procedures, if any other further procedures are required, and please state for the minutes why.
Thank you, Convener. After today's site visit, I feel I have sufficient information. Thank you.
Right. As members feel they have sufficient information, we will now hear from Ms. Green on the relevant policies and considerations for this review. Back to you, Ms. Green.
Thank you. I'll just share the screen again. Sorry, it's a bit of a delay when I change the slides. Right. So the site is zoned in the local development plan, the adopted local development plan 2017, under policy NC6, Town District Neighbourhood and Commercial Centres. So in these areas, retail is the proposed use. However, a mix of use is desirable. The criteria within this policy are really where proposals seek to change from retail to non-retail, so they're not particularly relevant in this case. Policy H1 on residential areas relates to new residential developments and states that they will be approved in principle if they, well, the first criteria, do not constitute overdevelopment. Oops, sorry, that's moved the slide on. I'll just go back. Right, sorry about that. So the first criteria is relating to overdevelopment. So it's for members to consider whether they feel the proposal constitutes overdevelopment. Secondly, whether the proposal has an unacceptable impact on the character and amenity of the surrounding area. So that's really for members to consider what they consider the character of the area to be and determine whether the proposal would adversely affect it and harm the amenity currently afforded to residents. The third criteria relates to loss of open space, and this proposal doesn't affect public open space. And finally, whether it complies with supplementary guidance. And there are various relevant supplementary guidances. Turning to the other policies which were included by the CAFES officer in their report, policy D1 on design, I'll cover in the next slide separately. D2 on landscaping, this really states that proposals, or it seeks to ensure that there's a landscape plan submitted with proposals so that the development contributes to the wider landscape setting of the area. In terms of policy D3 on big buildings, this policy really relates to looking at context, views and microclimate, and also high quality materials for big buildings. And it's probably worth noting that the applicant feels this one is not relevant to the proposal. It talks about the city centre more, although big buildings are actually defined as where they're larger than other buildings within the surrounding area. So policy D5 on granite heritage seeks the retention and reuse of granite buildings. And policy NC4 on the sequential approach It really sets out the hierarchy of town centres where larger footfall generating uses should be located, so not highly relevant in this case. Policy I1 seeks infrastructure contributions towards infrastructure where the commensurate with facilities needed by the development. So that would be relevant to the response from the developer obligations team seeking contributions for core paths, etc. Policies T2 and T3 set out how the development should manage transport requirements, including being accessible by active and sustainable transport. And policy T5 on noise. Well, we've had a noise impact assessment from the developer, and environmental health don't object to that. So the case officer didn't recommend refusal on that basis. In terms of density, policy H3, it sets out a minimum density of 30 dwellings per hectare. And it's worth noting that that's set to increase in the proposed plan. Development exceeds the level within both the adopted and the proposed local plans. However, that is really for larger sites over 1 hectare. But the policy does also note the need to consider the local characteristics and surroundings whilst creating an attractive residential environment, and it notes that higher densities may be appropriate in local centres. Policy H5 on affordable housing requires 25% affordable housing, as I noted in the response from the housing team, and NE4 on open space. It notes that for brownfield sites, such as this one, contributions can be made towards off-site enhancement instead of providing open space on site. Policy NE5 seeks protection of trees and woodland where these are of value visually and to biodiversity. And there's been a tree survey carried out on this site, as I showed you the plan. Policy NE6, it seeks sustainable urban drainage schemes to deal with surface water, and there has been a drainage impact assessment submitted and proposals for surface water attenuation. Policy NE8 seeks protection of natural habitat and protected species, and there was a bat survey submitted with the application. Policy R2 on contaminated land, to note that there was a report submitted and that no intrusive work was recommended, and our contaminated land team had no objection to the proposal. Policy R6 requires development to provide facilities for refuse disposal, and policy R7 requires measures to be implemented to reduce carbon emissions. And it's been noted in the case officer's report that those could be conditioned. Policy on digital infrastructure requires all new residential development to have access to high-speed communications, and that could potentially be conditioned also. So just going back to policy D1 on design. So all developments must ensure high standards of design which respond to context. And then there are the 6 essential qualities there. I think the report particularly mentions welcoming. This slide is just a reminder of the primacy of the development plan, that all applications be determined in accordance with development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And finally, the basis for decision. Do members consider that the proposed development would comply with any NC 6, which was the town centres policy relating to retail use? In terms of policy H1 for residential developments, how would it affect the character and amenity of the area? Would it constitute overdevelopment? And would there be an adequate level of amenity be provided for residents in terms of light, outlook and density, etc.? And then the other further considerations that relate to the policies I've just mentioned: access, parking, refuse, landscaping, bats, drainage, trees, affordable housing and developer obligations. So overall, does the proposal comply with the development plan, or are there material considerations which would weigh for or against the proposal? Okay, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Are there any further questions from Ms. Green? I believe you had one, Councillor Allard.
Thank you very much, Convener. I might enter you with two group of questions. The first one will be on the removal of car parking space. Where we parked this morning, there is dispute about the number of parking space there is. And if that parking spaces are used or are not used, or should be used, or should not be used. I think the applicant is talking about 3 parking spaces in the front. No, 4 space currently at the side are private and not available for the public in reality. But in practice, it looked like that one of the opponents said there were 5. So I don't know how we can use. How do we calculate this 18? Because I've got not only this private or not car park used or not used, either 5 or 3 or 4. And as well, this morning we looked in front of the building. It seems that on the plan it said there are only 3 parking spaces, and we counted that there could be at least 5, if not 6. So if a removal of all those parking space, I'm trying to count how many we have and how many we're gonna have at the end, and you can arrive to a lot of conclusions. Any information can help us on this?
So the parking spaces on site, what the applicant is saying about those is that they're on private land, and although they're being used at the moment, they could be closed off. I mean, I thought there were 4, but they're not marked out, so I suppose it's how many cars can squeeze onto there, but 4 seems a reasonable number. I think the applicant said 3, but it did appear from this morning that you could probably get 4 on. In terms of the on-street parking, yes, it did appear that you could get 5 spaces. See, the access would be widened, and so the plan that we've got showing 3 on-street spaces would be with visibility to the slightly widened access. They're showing that there would be 3 spaces remaining on street.
So we're talking, at least that we know, a loss of 2, and it might be a loss of 5 or 6, depending of if we're taking, in reality, a loss of 2 definitely, because nobody has caught enough there because I parked this morning, but it could be a loss of 4 or 6 depending. Now the question is 18 acceptable on the policy T2? What is the threshold?
Well, the supplementary guidance on transport has a maximum parking of 1.5 spaces per flat. So the applicant would be providing 1 space per flat. Let me just go back to that slide.
So we are already short.
Well, the roads team do not object to the level of parking. So they are providing 16 spaces for that. Well, they're calculating 14 flats in the new build scheme with 1 space per flat, which would equate to 14 spaces, and then 2 spaces for the existing flat, which makes 16, and they're providing 18. So it's slightly over 1 per flat. And then for the retail unit, they're saying 2 spaces are needed for the new retail unit, and there would be 3 spaces in front of the retail unit. That obviously includes in front of the existing one as well. So there are 18 on site and 3 in front.
Yeah, I'm still confused about it's acceptable because there are mitigation, but is out with the normal guidance. Is it that? What is the exact?
Well, the guidance is a maximum. So because it's close to public transport, the roads team feel that it's acceptable. Now, the case officer's report takes a slightly different view and feels that it's below the 1.5 per flat. It's really up to members to consider what you feel about that parking level.
Okay, I was more asking the question for the concern about the parking for other people who are using that private area because it's open, like I did this morning, and for as well the people who are using in front of the existing retailer who has already 5 or 6 spaces, which is going to be limited to 3. So that partly answers the question, and I know it's very difficult to answer. The other group of questions I have, maybe only one, is about this tree.
Mm.
I understand very well that there is no trees on the site, and all the trees are around the site.
Yeah.
Now it's very difficult for us to take these trees into account because these trees will not exist at all because they could go down at any time without us being able to do nothing about it.
Yes, they're not protected. That's right.
So really, they are not masking anything. They're not doing. We couldn't take them in consideration to say, for example, the elevation of the building is high enough, but it's masked by the trees because those trees are not on the ground of the person who owns it. Therefore, we can't take it in consideration. Will that be right? We can't take them in consideration at all.
I suppose you can take into account that the proposal wouldn't involve removing them, and the report says that they wouldn't be damaged. So from that point of view, you could take into account that the proposal wouldn't damage them, but it wouldn't be. Yeah, they are beyond the control of the applicant for them to remain. It's up to the owner of that land.
Okay, so the existing trees are not of the benefit to the applicant because the applicant doesn't have any control on them. It's what I wanted to know, and I wanted to check that we have no control on these trees as well.
Unless, yeah, they're not protected. So
they're not protected, so anything can happen to them, or could have already happened to them before we left. So that answers all my questions. Thank you very much for the answer, Ms. Green, and thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you, Councillor Allard. Councillor Thompson, do you have any questions? No, that's a shake of the head. I think Councillor Allard asked the questions that I was going to ask about the parking. So I think we'll just move on. In accordance with the procedure notes circulated, the local review body will now discuss and decide the manner in which the review is to proceed. I would highlight that all representations relating to the case have been considered and taken into account. We now move on to the determination. I will be upholding the officer's recommendations to refuse this application, and I'm basically doing it under policy NC6 with regard and the adverse effect that it will have on the centre of Peter Kuta. I also have concerns in the fact with H1 that I was genuinely surprised this morning when we got there how small the site was. So under H1, I think it is an overdevelopment on the site, and I think it would have a fairly large impact on the local amenity. Leading on from the overdevelopment H3, the density, again, I think within the Peter Kuta area, I think it is, the density is too high. And also policy D3, the scale. I know that there was something that it was mentioned that the scale of buildings would normally be considered within the city centre. However, looking at the impact that the 4 stories, the maximum of 4 stories, would have on the local area, and particularly the 3 stories that we're facing onto the main road through Peter Kuta, I do think it would be overdevelopment. I think under policy D1, it would be detrimental to the quality of place. So that is why I will be upholding the officer's recommended decision to refuse. Councillor Allard, can you please state your decision in respect to the application and state for the minute the grounds for that decision, referring to planning policy where appropriate?
Thank you, Convener. I will also go with the officers on the refuse. And as you said, I put H1 on overdevelopment, D1 as well for design, and D3, of course, because as we have just been told, big building is not only the city center, but it's as well compared to other building around it. And I would absolutely follow you on this one. H3, density too high to the level of the local plan. I would agree on that as well. That will be the main one, but H3D1. But I would like to add as well that there is a possible conflict regarding the cars park on the policy T2, and also as well possible conflict policy NE5 for the tree removal, because there are question marks about these two things. So that will be my views, and let me thank everybody who made representations, because I think it was important for the that helped us, I think, going through. And I've got to say, Convener, as well, thank you for the visit, even if I objected to it. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Allard. Councillor Thompson, moving on to you. Could you please state your decision in respect to the application and state for the minute the grounds for that decision, referring to planning policy where appropriate?
Thank you, Convener. And just to confirm that I would also recommend that we uphold the officer's recommendation. The things that struck me at the site visit today, that policy D3 about big buildings, people may think of that as being city centre, but going by the scale of this development compared to the predominantly 1.5-storey buildings in the immediate area, to me it is a big building. I mean, reference had been made to neighbouring developments, but they were either set right back from the road or were designed in such a way that the upper floors were less intrusive visually. So I would be minded about that. And it does, the context under policy D1, the context is that Peter Cooter does still feel and look like a village. And with the 1.5 story being the predominant height of buildings in that area, then it does feel that this would be just too big, would have an unacceptable impact on visual amenity. Also under H1 residential amenity, the spaces, the green spaces within the site are quite elevated as well. How accessible would they be? They do feel quite small in comparison to the number of properties. And it does feel to me like the density is too high for this site. And that, yeah, it's, as I say, those are the reasons I think which yourself, convener, and Councillor Allard have already covered most of that already. So yes, in broad agreement with your thoughts as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson.
Sorry, convener, if I could just come in, I wonder if Councillor Allard could just clarify. He made comments about policies T2 and NE5 in relation to car parking and tree removal, but I wasn't 100% clear whether he was using those as reasons for refusal. I think just for the minute, we need to be clear. Councillor Allard, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Convener, and for you, Convener. I just wanted to make it clear that I do understand that they not directly oppose it, but I'm saying they could be in conflict, and that conflict still exists. So I will use them as secondary argument as possible conflict.
But there wouldn't be reasons for refusal, Councillor Allard, is what you're saying?
At this time, no, I will say not for refusal, but possibility of conflict. So I wanted to make sure I had them. They didn't go to the threshold of refusal, but I think it's important to note them that they are a matter of conflict.
Thank you, Councillor Allard. One further matter, convener, if I may. This is as a matter of non-determination, and so when we say we're upholding the officer's recommendation, of course the officer didn't make a recommendation in time prior to the date of non-determination, and so the LRB wouldn't be upholding the officer's recommendation. It would be deciding to refuse the application because this was a non-determination matter.
Thank you for clarifying that. So I take it we were just refusing the application on behalf of ourselves.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much. Sorry about
on behalf of the planning authority.
On the behalf of the planning authority. Yes. So yeah. So the local review for bodies therefore agreed to unanimously. That's what's happening. The notes that I've got here, I've got that in. So yeah, we are refusing the application on behalf of the local planning authority. And I believe that is the business concluded.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you, convener. I can just
And
stop.
I'd just like to thank all. I'd just like to thank all before everyone disappears off. Just like to thank all the officers and everything for their time and effort on this, and the two councillors on the review, the local review body as well. And I hope you all manage to enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you.